appreciating that. Let's see, where are we going here? All right. Okay, so today we're going to finish chapter 8 and start some of the information from chapter 9. Okay. And then Thursday we will finish chapter 9, and I think that puts us in line for a review session and an exam next week. But I have to double check the syllabus, okay? But just be aware that that's coming up. Okay. Let's see if I can get to PowerPoint here. This one. Okay, that's good. Okay. So we had looked at the maturation of the skeleton. And now the maturation we're going to look at is physiological. So remember from chapter 1 that maturation means we're looking at a qualitative change in the system. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of systems here. So it's children and youth, so especially during puberty, as they get older, we're seeing not just their growth in their size, but we're also looking at maturation for the systems. And this occurs at different rates, and they're not definitely related. Right? So I might grow in size and that system is not maturing, or vice versa. We can see maturation in some systems without necessarily increasing growth. Okay? So we've got an interesting situation if you work with younger children or children who have not finished puberty yet, because the individual variation in maturation can be quite dramatic. So, for example, you could have two children who are quite different in size, but relatively similar on a maturation scale, or the other way around, right? They could be similar sizes, but very, very different in their maturation levels. And so it's difficult when you're teaching this group. You can't lump everybody together and assume that everybody is at the same stage. And our growth and our maturation rate don't always match. You know, when in our school system, we identify children by their chronological age, and that's how we group them, right? But chronological age doesn't mean that everybody in that room is at the same stage of growth or maturation of their systems. Okay, so it's quite difficult to infer maturity from their size or from their chronological age at all, right? We also have so not just the age, but we have early maturers and late maturers, right? And we have the idea that girls mature earlier than boys do. So we've got all these variables that we have to consider if we're working with this kind of age group. Okay. So one of the guides that we have is the development of the secondary sex characteristics, and these characteristics appear during puberty as the sexual hormones are released. So for girls, that's more estrogen than testosterone, and that stimulates growth of the ovaries and the womb and the breasts. And for the boys, later than the girls, it's the buildup of testosterone more than estrogen that stimulates secondary sex characteristics for the boys, right? Their scrotum and other characteristics, hair on their chests and things like that. So these characteristics are going to appear earlier for the girls than the boys, and earlier for an early maturer than a late maturer. Okay? So, as I said, lots of variables going on there. Remember that we said that the menstrual cycle, menarche, follows peak height velocity for girls by around 11 to 12 months. There isn't a similar window for the boys' sexual system, right? There's no similar timing for them. Viable sperm is a gradual process, right? They don't have this sudden, like for a girl, she's not able to have a baby and then able to have a baby. That doesn't happen for boys, right? It's a much more gradual maturation of their systems, right? So you can keep an eye out for those variations, right? If you're working with a preteen or early teen group, then you can watch this process in action. It's fascinating, right? So maturation is a structural constraint. If we go back to our triangle from the beginning of the semester, all right? So it's an individual constraint, but it's a structural constraint, not a functional constraint, all right? So if we're working with this group, what often happens is that the children who are early maturers are likely to be stronger and have better coordination in their motor skills than the children who are late maturers, okay? So if you, let me check which page it is here, I just have it. If you look at page 170, they're asking you to question the idea that, if these early maturers are stronger, they're often bigger, right? And they're typically more coordinated, then they're likely to be the star player. If they like sports, right? Then they're likely to be the star player on a young team. And so what the authors are asking you to consider here is what happens, right? What happens when everybody else in the class catches up, right? And oftentimes, the parents have kind of got used to their child being the star, and they expect that to continue. But of course, once everybody else catches up, then that individual who was an early maturer may no longer be taller, stronger, bigger than everybody else in the class. And so that status of their position in the sport team might change, right? And that can be quite difficult for the parents to confront, and also difficult for the child, right? They're used to being the winner, they're used to being the fastest, and now they're not, possibly, right? Now, there is some research that indicates from a motor development, motor control, coordination point of view, that extra time that they had performing skills well because they matured early does pay off a little bit in coordination and motor skill competency. So they do get possibly that little benefit from it, but they may not be the star anymore, right? So you have to be ready to explain what's going on to the parents, explain to the child why this is happening, and hopefully smooth everything over so that people's expectations are not just completely like trashed, right? Because that can be that can be difficult, right? If you started to think, ooh, little Johnny's going to be a star, you know, and then little Johnny isn't the star anymore. So when we have these periods of rapid growth, so we talked about the idea of teratogens in the rapid growth periods of the embryo and the fetus, right? Well, that same scenario applies to the rapid growth that occurs during year 1 and year 2, and then the rapid growth that occurs during puberty. Okay, so there's much more influence from external factors as we grow once we're outside the womb, right? So one of the things that can happen is an idea that we call catch-up growth. And so this demonstrates, and the diagram is very simple but very powerful, I think, figure on page 172, figure 8.9, shows how catch-up growth works. So the idea is that for some reason there's some negative influence on the child during a rapid growth phase. And so they don't grow as quickly as they should. So that could be malnutrition, it could be an illness of some kind, right? And so their curve slows down. It doesn't follow their normal curve. And the idea of catch-up growth is that once we remove the negative influence, whatever that was, and we restore a more positive environment, then that child is going to do a rapid spurt and end up back where they would have been in the first place, all right? Doesn't always happen. It depends on the severity and the length of time that the negative influence was in place, right? So sometimes catch-up growth doesn't quite get back to its original genetic potential, okay? But hopefully, in most cases, when we take away, when the child recovers from the illness and they're well and healthy and eating well and playing, then we would see this idea of catch-up, okay? So think about, which extrinsic factors could be playing a role here, right? Nutrition is key. So if the young baby is not getting complete nutrition for some reason, right? Unlikely to happen in this country, but it's a big world, right? There are plenty of places on the planet where babies do not receive the nutrition that they need to grow properly, right? During adolescent growth spurt, they could get a really bad case of measles or some other kind of long-standing disease that impacts their ability to grow for a while, okay? So, if you remember our S-curve, the idea is that once we've finished puberty, that we're mostly not growing. So for some individuals, there's still a little bit of change in height. Their trunk still lengthens out a little bit into their 20s. But typically, height is stable during adulthood until we get much older. Okay, and then when we get much older, a couple of things can happen. The first one is that the cartilage and other connective tissues in between the processes of the spine, right, get compressed over time, right? They lose their kind of bounce, they get a little bit stiffer, and they get compressed. And so we see a slight decrease in trunk length that then relates to a little bit of decrease in height. And actually, what you'll find, like now in my 50s, I find that I'm taller first thing in the morning than I am in the evening or at night. So when I get in my car in the morning and I adjust the mirror, if I have to drive later in the day, I have to adjust the mirror again because I kind of am not as tall as I was in the morning. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. Okay. So the other thing that can happen is a little more dangerous and more dramatic in outcome, can be dramatic in outcome. And that's osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is loss of bone density. So it means that my bones get very brittle, the spaces in the bone get wider, and the arches in the bone get narrow and thin, and so it's at much more risk of breaking. So if that occurs in your vertebral column, then your vertebrae can literally disintegrate at certain times. And so there are some great visual pictures in the textbook that show you like a dowager hump. So if you have this kind of idea, that often happens because these vertebrae at the top of the column and into the neck have crumbled a little bit, right? Or you can get some crumbling lower down here and it drops you down in height. So that can be quite dodgy. We also, for females, we have to be careful of our hips because it's quite often you get osteoporosis in the hips and then you're more likely to break your hip. So we want to keep our bones strong. Lots of weight-bearing exercise, lots of calcium and other minerals, right? Walking, yoga, resistance training, right? Swimming and cycling are really good exercises for your cardiovascular system, but they do not help with bone health. So you don't want to rely just on those as your activity, right? Make sure you get some weight-bearing activity as well. So weight should be stable, right? If we think about S-curve, we stop growing, and so weight should be stable. But as we said last week probably, that weight is much more variable. It's much more influenced by your environment and your lifestyle, okay? So often what we see is that adults start to put on weight in their 20s, and often that weight is fat mass because their lifestyle has changed, right? You graduate from college and you have a family now and you've got a full-time job and you have to run the kids to school and you've got to get the shopping done and you've got to work and, right? And you have to make time to socialize with your kids and your partner and all these things take away time from your physical activity, or can take away time from your physical activity and exercise, which means that, you know, we start to lose some muscle mass, but we gain some fat mass typically, right? Again, you guys are not a typical population, so this may not be the picture for you, but watch people around you now at your age and watch what happens, right? So the older we get, the more muscle mass we lose anyway, just because that's what happens. So if we don't maintain some physical activity, we lose more muscle mass than we need to, right? So these extrinsic factors play a bigger part of the picture the older we get. And in this country, we do have an aging population. So, you know, we don't know very much about older adults. You know, relatively little about older adults compared to adults of your age, teenagers, and adults into their kind of 30s, 40s. Once we get to 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we don't really know very much about that older population. We don't know very much physiologically, like how do they respond, and I'm just starting to see a lot of that turning up in the research, is how do older adults respond to training programs that we've used for donkeys with younger adults, right? So there's all kinds of interesting information. A couple of years ago, I did a balance training workshop. So, and it was all about how to teach older adults exercise based on Tai Chi, but that can keep their legs strong and teach them how to maintain their balance. Okay. So in another 9 years or so, the estimation is that over a quarter of the population will be 65 and older in this country, right? Not across the planet. But. So as movement specialists, what we need to know is what's expected to happen in this population, right? We have these stages of development of these skills for little people, but we don't know what to expect from these skills as the individual gets older and older and older. What's typical? We don't really know, right? And I remember watching my nan. My nan lived to 92, so she had a good old time. But I remember that the last, I don't know, 5, 8 years, she really didn't leave the house. And she would get up and make herself breakfast and tea in the morning, and then she'd go and sit down and listen to the radio, or she was real good at watching game shows that made her think about the answers and things to keep her brain going, and she would do the crossword in the paper, and so she did all this stuff for her brain, but she didn't do anything for her body. And it got to a point where she literally did not leave the house for years, right? And it made me really sad, because I don't think that has to happen. If people can maintain their physical activity over the course of their adulthood, then you can get to be in your 80s and 90s and still be active, right? So we have this gentleman here. This picture is quite old now, but he was in his 70s, I believe, when this picture was taken. So you can see what can be done if we maintain our physical activity. I think I've told you before that my dad, he's now 85. he trains, he lifts every day, 5 days a week, and he has a cycle ergometer that he bikes on every day for 40 minutes, and then he does his lifting routine. And is he losing muscle mass? Yes, he is. I mean, I can see it. And I haven't actually seen him other than on a screen now in over a year, so I suspect I'll be quite shocked at how small he looks when I finally get to go home. But he's strong, and he's independent, and he can get up and down the stairs, and you know, it makes a big difference to the quality of your life, I think, right? So we want to stay active. We can't stop muscle loss, but we can delay it or slow it down, right? We can't stop our joints getting less flexible as all the connective tissue gets stiffer, but we can keep ourselves as mobile as possible, right? So that we can maintain our independence and maintain our quality of life. And as I said, there's more and more research coming out now on an older population that indicates that even something relatively simple from an exercise standpoint can not only slow down the decline in movement skills, but in certain skills we can reverse the decline, right? And we can bring those skills back up a little bit, which is very cool, I think. Okay, so questions on growth and aging. Overall growth and aging. We're going to look at particular body systems in a minute, but this overall pattern that we have, this S-curve. Any questions or comments or examples? Right? Otherwise, you're all going to get to know my family very well. Okay, no questions on chapter 8? You guys, I can't see you nodding. I need answers.
No.
Thank you. All right, so look at some fun stuff in this chapter. So we're going to look at a couple of different body systems. And again, what we're looking at are structural constraints on our triangle. And remember that the triangle theory, our constraints theory, says that if we alter one of the constraints, then it alters the interaction, and therefore a different movement pattern would emerge. All right, so that's the key to why we're looking at these systems and we're looking at growth and maturation, is that our interaction with our structural constraints is going to change the motor pattern that emerges and that we can observe, right? So we've got to know what's average for the body systems, and then if we understand what is average to expect to see, then we can identify something that is atypical if that occurs, and that can be important because if you're the teacher, coach, trainer, you may spend more time at the end of the day with an individual than their parents and their siblings do. So you're going to be in a prime position to identify if something is not typical, right? And it might need investigating. So we want to know the average pattern of change, and then we want to understand what's the range for individuals that would count as typical. So, you know, we don't expect everybody to be the same, right? So if I've got this range that is okay, this is normal, can I identify things that are abnormal, that are atypical? Okay, so a reminder, because we brought up rate limiting constraints, ages ago now, right, weeks ago. So a reminder about rate limiters. Rate limiters are individual constraints, right? And it's going to be the system that is the slowest to develop, that holds back the next step of the skill, right? So it rate limits the next step of the skill. At the other end of the lifespan, the rate limiter is going to be the system that declines the fastest to a critical point that impacts a motor pattern, right? So it depends which end of the age lifespan you are, right? But typically when we talk about rate limiters, we're talking about the system that's slowing down the next step of motor skill development. Okay? So, think about the picture that I showed you of the baby with the primary ossification centers in the middle of its long bones, right, where that cartilage was starting to lay down minerals and turn the cartilage into bone, right, the primary ossification centers. So when we grow postnatally, what we see is growth at secondary ossification centers, okay? And in long bones, those secondary ossification centers are at the ends of the bone, all right? So we have plates at the ends of our long bones, so that's our humerus and our arms, our fingers, our legs, our toes, right? They're all long bones. Skull is not a long bone. Wrists are not a long bone, right? But the fingers and the arms are long bones. So they all have these secondary ossification centers that are called epiphyseal plates, all right? And in everyday language, we call them growth plates. Okay. So that's where long bones get longer, right? We lay extra bone at the ends and they get longer. The other way long bones can grow is they have to get thicker around the middle, right? And so we can also lay cells down on the outside of the shaft of the bone, and that's called appositional growth. So the epiphyseal plates are very sensitive to the changes in sex hormones that occur during puberty. And so as you start to release for the girls more estrogen and for the boys more testosterone, as those hormones build up in the system, then they stimulate the closure of these epiphyseal plates. Okay? So the closure doesn't happen on all the long bones at the same time, but there's a window where those long bones are closing, all right? And typically, they're closed by 18 or 19 in boys, 16 or so for girls, and that's when we see the stop in our long bones. So any further growth occurs in the trunk, right? So that means that closure occurs earlier in girls because they go into puberty earlier than boys do. It's going to occur earlier for an early maturer than for a late maturer, right? And that feeds back to that idea of the star player who's an early maturer. They may end up nowhere near the tallest person in the class by the time the late maturers have had their growth spurt, right? So we have this interaction, this connection between our long bone growth and the maturation of our sexual systems, right? So one way of telling someone's skeletal age, because it's not necessarily going to match their chronological age, right, is by doing hand and wrist x-rays. And so in an x-ray department, they would have a big book full of these kinds of x-ray pictures that they can match the x-ray to get an idea of what skeletal age an individual has, a child typically, right? So on the left here, we have a much younger individual, right? So you can see here's the epiphyseal plate on the long bones of the fingers. So these fingers are still growing, right? Here's the start of some of the wrist bones, but we certainly don't have a complete set of wrist bones developing yet. And here is the epiphyseal plate on the end of the ulna. So, someone who's trained to take x-rays can take an x-ray of this child, compare that x-ray to their book, and they can come up with a skeletal age versus a chronological age. Okay. Over on the right here, you can see we've got almost closure of these, certainly a little bit here, right? The epiphyseal plates are starting to close. We've not got much more growth going on in the hand. We can see a much more complete picture of the wrists and the bones. They're all different shapes, and they don't grow the same way. They don't have a secondary ossification center like long bones do. Okay. And the epiphyseal plate at the end of the ulna is much tighter, and we can even see one over here. Whoops. Okay. So this is a way of finding out whether a child is an early maturer or a late maturer, right? Because the chronological age doesn't tell me that. It's also why you have to be careful with children that have not finished growing, right? If their skeletal system has not finished growing, you've got to be real careful with what you do in your PE class or with your athletes, because we can do some serious damage here. You can slide that epiphyseal plate off the end of the bone. That involves surgery to put it back, if it can be put back, right? And if it can't be put back, then we're going to have one arm or one leg shorter than the other, right? So there's all kinds of damage that we can do as the teacher, coach, trainer to these children's skeleton if we don't recognize at what point the skeleton has completely matured, right? So bone is an interesting tissue because unlike some other tissues that we have, it continually remodels and it absorbs old bone and it lays down new bone. So we're talking about the thickness here, not the length, obviously. All right, so the thickness of the bone. And so, for a long time, probably into our 40s or our mid-30s to our 40s, that balance between absorbing old cells and laying down new cells is relatively equal, right? So our bones can maintain their strength. Once we get to 35, 40 and older, we start to see the balance get skewed. And the old bone continues to be absorbed, but the laying down of the new bone slows down. And so now we're at a point where if we're not paying attention and we're not being physically active, then here's how osteopenia and osteoporosis can occur, right? Because I'm absorbing bone and I'm not stimulating, I'm not doing enough weight-bearing work to stimulate extra bone cells being laid down, right? And so the bones start to get thinner, they start to get more brittle, and they're at much more risk for fractures and complete breaks, right? And you can see on this diagram here, right, this is from the top of the femur, and you can see that this bone matrix is nice and strong, right? And then what happens as the bone is remodeled is these kind of holes get bigger and bigger, and the network, the matrix, gets thinner and thinner and more brittle, right? And then we're in trouble. Okay. Questions about the skeletal system?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So, on Thursday, we will look at the muscular system, and we will also look at the adipose system, which is, for me, of particular interest right now, given our overweight obesity issues. So understanding how the adipose system develops and the influences on that system, I think is a really fascinating topic to get your head around, because you can see it now in these children. If you just go to Walmart, you can see these kids who are grossly overweight for their age. Okay, so do please have a look. As I said, check the syllabus, but I think we have exam next week. All right, so do please start looking through the chapters and the PowerPoints and look at your website guides and be starting to practice this material so that you're ready for a review session and the exam next week. Okay? All right. Well, it's going to be another gorgeous day if you're here in Portales, ridiculously warm for this time of the year, and then it's going to be ridiculously cold at the weekend, so make the most of today. before the cold front comes in. All right? Have a good day. Enjoy the sun. And I'll see you tomorrow for